Hello, my name is Beth Rennie. I'm editor-in-chief at ASCM, and I am joined by our CEO, Abe Eshkenazi, for another episode of SCM this week. Hey, Abe, how you doing?
I'm fine, Beth, and yourself?
I'm doing all right. So for anyone who hasn't watched this before, this is the time when I get to talk to Abe a little bit more in depth about his Friday column. If you don't get a column from Abe every Friday in your email inbox, you can register for free at ascm.org/impact. So this past Friday, we talked about USMCA, the new trade agreement among the US, Mexico, and Canada. So obviously a lot of interesting topics around international trade. I think something that struck me is that, in supply chain, just getting goods moving among countries is a very complex and challenging undertaking. And then you add a trade agreement to it and it becomes, even more challenging. So Abe, what are some of the common problems that our industry professionals should be aware of? What should they be ready for with USMCA coming?
Yeah, I think you can take a look at USMCA and then start to extrapolate it to all the other type of trade agreements, whether TPP or others. Among the challenges that you have is what is in the national interest versus what is in economic interest, and those are not necessarily the same. And I think this is what challenges a lot of the supply chain professionals, is that when we're evaluating economic decisions, we're not necessarily impacting or assessing what political or policy decisions are in place or could be made that affect those trade agreements in the future. TPP is a good example of that. We entered into it a number of years ago, and then we're now out of that relationships right now with those countries. So as we start to evaluate whether a global, supply chain and or trade agreements are appropriate, some of the challenges that we have is the concept of what is in our national interest versus what is in the global interest. And I think those often diverge when we start to talk about economic policies versus human rights or labor issues across the globe. So as organizations are evaluating it, they need to evaluate not only on their particular products, but also the countries that they're working with. What are the past actions and what are the past policies of those organizations? Further, we're seeing some effects of the global trade being abused through theft of intellectual property. While working with other partners, you may in fact be giving them your competitive advantage in the marketplace. Additionally, we've seen countries respond to different trade agreements by dumping and or currency manipulations to affect the trade agreements or non-trade agreement products differently from those that are included in it. Lastly, we're seeing quite a bit of discussion right now on the protectionism or national security relative to PPEs, relative to food safety, as well as the pharmaceuticals. And as we start to get into the vaccine discussion later on here, we're going to have to pay particular attention to the not only production, but the distribution of these products across the globe. And I think this is the challenge that we face here as we're evaluating economic and supply chain issues. This goes into the humanitarian, this goes into product safety, as well as our own national safety and security interests. So the challenges with these trade agreements is that if the focus is on economic, you've only answered part of the solution or part of the equation for an effective global agreement. I think there has to be quite a bit more that's done on the policy side and understanding what are the potential pitfalls or benefits of these agreements, and then evaluate it on industry by industry, because it does not affect everybody in the same level.
Right. Well, you just hinted at the benefits. So although they are complex, trade agreements also do open doors. So what should our members and watchers be doing to maximize and really make the most of these opportunities, sort of making international trade work for them?
Yeah, I think at the top of the list is cooperation and trust. And you need to be able to trust your partners in not only the development of the relationship, but in the execution of the relationship. And this goes back to the dumping and or the protection or intellectual property theft. If you enter into an agreement with the assumption that there will be cooperation and trust, I think you can find a much more effective trade strategy for all parties in the agreement. But to do so, to get that trust, you're going to need visibility and you're going to need transparency. And this has not been a hallmark of organizations, either in trying to protect their intellectual property or protect their national interests. So we have sort of conflicting forces here relative to what it's going to take to get an effective agreement for cooperation and trust. And then the challenges that we identified in the beginning with intellectual property theft and dumping and protectionism, they're clashing in terms of the relationships that you need to develop. Additionally, I think we need to have a focus as a global response as opposed to a national response to some of the issues that we're facing here. The personal protection equipment is a great example. As we're seeing surges and we're seeing shifts in demand sweep across the globe, I think we need to be able to identify how can we respond better. This is a global community when we're dealing with a pandemic issue. This is not a function of a national issue, as we're seeing that there are impacts on the nations as this pandemic sweeps through and waves of it affect different economies and different populations. The global response is essential if we're going to be talking about medical supplies and or specifically with poor or developing nations. How do we support each other here? This cannot be only a focus on your national interest. Global trade agreements require joint responsibility and joint sort of benefits to do so. So as we're taking a look at these global agreements, a focus on labor and human rights has to be brought to the forefront for organizations that you deal with. Again, we've had this discussion in the past about sustainability and accountability. That goes for your partners as well, not just for your organization. And I think this is part of the challenge that a lot of organizations have in developing a global supply chain is, can you trust your partners and do you have transparency and visibility into their partners as well? So part of the challenge that, or part of the, the opportunities are overcoming the challenges that we identified in the first part of the discussion.
All right, and as you hinted at, we are going to actually go back 2 weeks and talk about something that you discussed in your Friday column a couple of Fridays ago, which had to do with the creation of a vaccine for COVID-19. And you talked about how this is going to demand a lot of collaboration, public and private, all over the world. But, as a lot of us have witnessed these past few months, they really have highlighted some of the gaps that exist in our ability to form these partnerships. So what can we do to fill these gaps moving forward and avoid future risk?
This is, I think, probably something that we should have had a discussion about as we entered the pandemic, because it's very difficult to catch up to the challenges that we're facing right now. And that is the perception that this is a local or a national issue as opposed to a global pandemic issue. If you take a look at the U.S. response, state by state, you see a quilt in terms of its response to the pandemic. Similarly, if you take nation by nation, you'll see a quilt in terms of the response, and yet we're not seeing the kind of consistency in terms of outcomes that we had expected. We don't seem to be learning as much. That's not to say that every country has done it right. Every country has made mistakes, but the question is, have you learned and have you adapted to the different information that you're seeing relative to the pandemic and the effect that it's having on a particular country or particular population? So this concept of national interest versus global health issue, I think, has to be in the discussion on a vaccine, specifically on who gets it. And how quickly can you develop the vaccine for the complete population? There have been estimates in terms of what can be produced and how quickly can we produce for the populations. We're talking about a global population for the vaccines. We're not just talking about local challenges that we have. So as we've evaluated, or as organizations, and this is a combined effort between global governments as well as private industry to come up with a response to this, I think we need to be close to the customer and based on need. Where is that need and how do we provide the necessary vaccines and or essential medicines to those countries and those poorer populations? This is not just a function of who can afford it. This is a function of who needs it as well as the paying side of the vaccine challenge. As we've seen with other countries, there have been appropriate responses. There have been inappropriate responses. Unfortunately, what we're seeing in the United States is too often that we're not getting on top of it, that we're seeing quite a challenge in terms of responding to it. So having restrictions on our travel into other countries has been quite a phenomenon for a lot of U.S. citizens, that we have been, in some effects, quarantined as a nation. And I think as we evaluate the vaccines and the distribution of it, I think we need to take a global response to the pandemic, as well as understanding how to respond better in the future. We've got a lot of lessons learned here. The question is, what do we do differently to respond to the types of challenges or disruptions that we're experiencing today? The vaccine is a great example on how we respond to it. On the backside of this, I think we'll say a lot about our focus on humanity, and more importantly, on the health of our global economy as well as our global population.
All right, thank you, Abe. And I would be remiss if I didn't also give a shout out to the upcoming issue of SCM Now magazine. The cover story is actually all about lessons learned during COVID-19, and that will be out next week. So thank you very much for your time, Abe. Thanks to all who are watching. And please remember to follow us on our LinkedIn and YouTube channels.
Thanks, Beth. Stay safe and healthy.
Thanks, you too.